Well, good morning or good afternoon almost here. We're right in front of lunch, so appreciate your attending the session. My name is Doug Cloco. I'm here to introduce the team that's going to walk you through today's session. I'm with Microsoft as an architect and had worked with the Accenture team extensively in building the solution that they're going to display today and walk you through the different components. So Joseph, Chris, and Greg will be involved in that effort. One thing to keep in mind, this work was completed about 18 months ago when we initialized the effort. And so we were using the MDT 2010 product, Update 1. Of course, MDT 2012 has been released, and there's some improvements, and look for some changes that, based on the work we did with Accenture, to be included there as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joseph.
Thank you, Doug. So my name is Joseph Parody. I was the lead architect for what we call the Managed PC Windows 7 deployment at Accenture. And we're going to break up our session today into a couple of sections because we want to have as much meat as possible for all of you to try and give you some information you can take back and use in your Windows 7 deployments. So I want to start with a little bit of context for those of you who don't know who Accenture is. We're a very, very large global company, and we have a very highly mobile workforce. Basically, our people are out at many clients like yourselves, helping you to be successful. So they're not in our offices. We don't have a campus or an online type of environment in our campuses. Our organization inside of our company around Workstation is separated between a central engineering team that builds the image and the deployment, and a set of local teams in 50 countries, 120 cities around the world who take that deployment and instantiate it for all of our thousands and hundreds of thousands of end users. So it gave us some opportunities, but also some challenges as we went along, and it may be similar or different to what you have. So where did we start? When we started this about 18 months ago, this pie chart probably looks different than what most of you have. I'm betting that there's very few people other than the people in the Microsoft audience who would have started this with a Vista deployment anywhere close to this large. So we had a pretty significant Vista deployment when we started, but we also had a lot of XP. One of the things that we did, and it's not the focus of this presentation, but I wanted to highlight it, was that we tried to embrace this notion that people talk about of consumerization of IT with regards to how our users looked at their workstation. So we wanted to take our work from simply saying we build a workstation image and throw it over the wall to saying we're in the end user compute business, right? Our end user's impression of what we do has nothing to do with what's on the DVD or USB media. It has to do with how we deploy it. It has to do with how their data comes over. It has to do with all of those sorts of things. And that really was a driving principle behind the work that we did in trying to make this deployment for our users. So a couple of our goals. We wanted to be fast and agile. Windows 7 was hot at the time. We had experience with both XP and Vista, thought that Windows 7 was going to be a great opportunity for us. We implemented direct access, which for our mobile workforce was a huge win. That required Windows 7. So we wanted to get there as soon as we could. We really wanted to drive our quality bar significantly above where we had ever been before. So we took a different view of our imaging approach. We took a different view on deployment, and we really focused on that end user experience. One of the things that was given to us as a requirement by our business was, oh yeah, you can't go hire a whole bunch of people to go do this, right? So get it out there fast, get it out there broadly, but don't go and get any more people to do it. This was right at the height of the economic downturn, so we didn't have much choice in pushing back on that one. And then finally, we wanted to do the best job that we've ever done about migrating data and settings. One of the feedback items that we had from our users was that it took them a week or so to get their workstation back to where it was before we started working on it, and we wanted to reduce that time to as close to zero as possible. So we had a couple of core deployment scenarios. Our Windows XP image and deployment used PointSec for full drive encryption, which was a requirement from our security team, but it introduced the challenge that if you're going from XP with PointSec to anything with BitLocker, you have to wipe the drive. There is nothing you can do in the interim unless you want to choose to unencrypt that drive, which then has a security implication, but more importantly, it adds about 6 hours to your imaging time while you wait for decryption to happen. So in that scenario, we had to get the data off, wipe the drive, get the data back on. Our Vista deployment, though, used BitLocker. So because it was using BitLocker, and because you can suspend BitLocker for the time when you lay down a new image, and because USMT 4.0 offers hardlink technology, we could actually do an upgrade, in quotes, in place where we replaced the entire image of the machine, leaving the data in place, rehydrating that data back into a domain account, and the user was on their way. And you'll hear more about that when Chris talks. But this was a really big win, and if you are an XP shop today that doesn't use any sort of a full drive encryption product, this is something you can do in your deployments so that you don't have to spend as much effort and you can move more quickly. Finally, we had new machines, right? We have machines, they get to their end of life, we need to replace them. We wanted to make sure that that experience was optimal for our users. The tools that we used from Microsoft, and this is going to be potentially a little different than what some other organizations would use. We used MDT and Light Touch, right? We used the image build and the deployment with Light Touch, and there's some infrastructure reasons why that was the right choice for us. If you haven't looked at Light Touch, I would urge you to really make sure that you look at that as an option. It may fit your needs really well. USMT 4.0, great upgrade from that team. The hardlink technology was a lifesaver for us, and it's only getting better with update 1 of USMT. DFS is how we get our image out to our 50 countries around the world. So we have an entire deployment that is 28, 30 gigs in size. We push that out every month. DFS is the way that we do that. If you're using DFS and you haven't gotten to 2008 R2, strongly encourage you to do that. 2008 R2 DFS is much better than 2003 was. And then WDS, we started with a few locations. Now actually the majority of our locations are using WDS to get the image down. We had a lot of people who were in love with USB sticks in the past. Now we're moving to WDS. So these are the tools that we used to do our deployment. Another item that we wanted to talk to you about, and it may or may not be relevant for you, but having a separate central engineering and imaging team and then a whole pile of local teams that deploy the image introduced the opportunity in the past for the central team to chuck the image over the wall and say, we're done, right? Success, get the check mark. And the local teams, right, sort of stood there and it landed on them. And what we did this time is we said, no more, right? And we gathered a set of local technicians, brought them into our virtual team, and had them review and sign off on all of the designs that we did. And we had some famous situations where we proudly presented to them our fantastic engineering that we had done, and they threw up all over it and said, go back. Here's why, from a business perspective, it doesn't work for us. And it was a struggle for the team to have that type of experience, but it really made us better. And what we have now works so well for the technicians and for the central team that we can't think of doing it any other way. So at this point, I've finished the context. Now we want to get into the what did we do, and then we're going to have some more depth on the how did we do it. Chris?
Hello, my name is Chris Marino. I'm the lead workstation architect for Accenture. I'm responsible for the design of the global workstation image. I'm going to talk about deployment, delivery, and efficiency. So for our deployment, we created a single MDT light touch deployment with 5 separate processes. And those 5 processes will meet any deployment scenario that we might have. The first 2 are prep and new. Most of the common scenarios that we have, like new hire PC, PC replacement, loaner PC, and hardware upgrades, will fall under these 2 processes. Prep is a deployment of our base thick image to a PC. It's user agnostic. It doesn't have any user configs. We do things like join the domain, add the computer object into a staging OU so that it receives only base policy, and also that we configure any global applications as part of the wizard process of choosing applications. The next process in here is called new, and this is where we install user configs, user applications, anything that's relevant to that specific user. And also as part of this process, we're going to move the object from the staging OU to a specific OU, which will provide all of the configurations that are needed for that user. That includes BitLocker, any kind of WMI filtering that's required so that policies can be applied to that specific user. The third process we have is a refresh. And this is an in-place upgrade from Windows Vista to Windows 7. Like Joseph mentioned, we use USMT4 with hardlink support for our data and security configurations. The best thing about this is, the data stays on the local drive. It creates restore points for each one of the files. So as the upgrade is taking place, it re-images around that data. And then when the image is complete, the restore points restore all of the data links to the data so that when the user boots up for the first time, that data is already in the same location that it was before the process started. And then finally, it's a self-service capability. What we wanted to make sure is that anyone could use this. This is an option for a user. A user can go up, get this, start the deployment at their time. There's no requirement for a schedule. There's no requirement for tech support to be available. You can start this before tech support gets into the office, or you can start it after they leave. The last two, capture and restore. This is specific to migrating data, but we want to do in these processes, we want to capture the data either to a USB media or to a share. So USMT does this. We leverage that to save the data and the settings to an external drive or a share, and it's available for restore later. The restore process we have is the same as the new process. It's going to configure the user configurations. It's going to set up the user. It's going to add them to any local membership, group memberships that need to be made. But it's also going to have the option to restore the data that we captured in the previous process to a new prep machine. As far as delivery, we needed to make sure that, since we're going to give this out to users, it needed to be small enough so that we could put it on a USB key so that we could provide it to the user. The user could take it. It's not something that they have to, a huge drive that they would have to carry, or they wouldn't have to be in an office where they would have to run this off of a share. Also, we wanted to make sure that everything that's in the process would be able to resolve any kind or meet any kind of scenarios or requirements that the technicians would have to run. So if someone brought in a machine, they could use a combination of the 5 processes to resolve any kind of issues that came in, and also have the ability to deploy and also give this to users so they can perform their refresh on their time schedules. I mentioned the self-service option. This just is going to give flexibility to the user. It's going to empower them to be able to do these deployments at their own schedule. And then lastly, we had to make sure that it was globally applicable. Had to be able to support multiple languages. And also, since we're a global company, we have multiple machine types and also models. So one deployment supports all of our hardware models, supports all of the languages, and we also have configurations that are set as part of our deployment to meet any kind of local legal compliance. And as efficiency goes, in most deployments, when you start, there's some kind of process that stops halfway through, or there's something, you get to a point and you have to enter some kind of credentials, or you have to choose something. We wanted to make this as easy as possible, and we wanted to follow a model, which is start the deployment, be able to walk away, and when you get back, it's complete. So what we did was we moved all of the prompts that we would have as part of a deployment all the way to the beginning of the wizard, right? So that you make your choices, make your selections, you start your deployment, you walk away, or you go home for the night. Technicians can leave that day, come back, and the next morning, it is complete. To ensure we had some success, we added a couple of features to our deployment. One of the first things we added was a pre-launch checklist. Some people refer to it as pre-flight. where we created a custom application that just goes and looks for conditions on the workstation before the deployment starts to ensure that we can resolve those things, network connectivity, maybe applications being in use. We can close those down and then start the deployment where MDT would start up. And then finally, we included a health check tool. This is to give some kind of UI or some kind of information to the user or technician that everything has been configured and is ready to hand off to the user. These things include things like BitLocker encryption. You want to make sure it's encrypted, OU membership, local group membership. And in some cases, you might have something like a deployment mechanism like SCCM, a config manager that you want to make sure is installed. With this, I'm going to hand this off to Greg, and he's going to talk to you about web services.
All right. Thank you, Chris. My name is Gregory Bracey. I am an architect on the global workstation team at Accenture, along with Chris. And I get to talk to you about something which I think is pretty cool, cool idea, which is abstracting the business logic layer out of the deployment media as much as possible. We did this via a set of web services that we stood up. And then we were able to call these web services from script within MDT. And we'll show you that in a minute here. And MDT actually makes this very easy to do. So I think it's a very attractive option for you if you have the ability to do this. The main benefit we realized out of this was our ability to make changes that as our business and our business logic behind the scenes changed, we could make changes to accommodate that without having to go ahead and update thousands of pieces of deployment media and then sending out communications and then having people that oops, I'm still using deployment media from a month ago, I forgot to do it now, my machine's in the wrong OU, can you help me out? And that's one of the actual good example that we had. We started out with our OU structure as about 5 OUs related to our geographical areas within Accenture. And that was working fine. About a few months into our deployment of Windows 7, we had need to do some business changes to have additional OUs. And instead of having to update a script on deployment media points throughout our office locations and in our users' hands, we were able to make those changes to some code on the back-end web services. The deployment media continues to call the same same method as it did before, and everything just works. So it was a great advantage for us. A second point that was an advantage for us too was we removed some of the dependency on sort of those administrative types of activities in Active Directory. We were able to move that off of the deployment media and into our data center to run on the web services, which was a huge advantage for us, not only in terms of speed and being able to make changes, but also from a security perspective as well. And we utilized the web service class that is available in the ZTI data access.vbs script that you have out of the box with MDT. And that web service uses an object, an MS-XML2 object, to go ahead and make those calls for you. So it allows you to very easily consume a web service method from VB script in deployment. And here's an example. This is sort of a generic example, and we'll show you more actual specific implementation of it in just a moment here. But as you can see, we have about, I think, 5 or 6 lines of code here to call a web service from MDT. So, I think very doable. I'd like to talk, before we get into the demonstration of calling it, I want to talk about some of the key web service methods that we implemented in our deployment and why they were important for us. The first being get new computer name, which seems like a fairly trivial thing, but actually is fairly difficult and actually a big win for us. We wanted to be able to return a name that was unique within Active Directory, so we can easily identify that machine. And then also we wanted to have a name that was not based off of or tied to the geographic location or the hardware, like the serial number of the laptop. And this was an advantage for us in terms of support, being able to quickly get users up on their feet. For instance, they come in with their laptop, the screen is cracked, they can take the drive out, put it into a similar laptop of make and model, and get the user on their way. They don't have to rename the machine object, anything like that, because it is not tied to their physical hardware. The second one here is user ID valid. Was important for us because early on in the deployment, whether it's being done by the user in our self-service model or by the technician, we want to verify that the user ID that's typed in exists in our Active Directory and is correct. because we want to have that upfront validation so that we don't, oops, typed in the wrong ID halfway through the deployment, now it fails because it can't find it. So we want to do that check up front, and this allowed us to do that. The third one here on the slide, the get OU by user ID. As I mentioned, we had our OUs arranged around our geographic locations. This allowed the user and the technician as well just to simply enter in their ID at the beginning and to reuse that information. We would make the call into Active Directory, find out where that user was based off of, and based on our code logic in the web service, we were able to put the machine in the right OU automatically for them. The one on the top of this slide, the Get Regional Domain Controller, this is the one I'll be demonstrating for you in just a moment. This was important to us for a couple of reasons. This would, based on the IP address of the client machine, so the workstation that was being imaged, would get the closest domain controller server to that machine. And it was important for us to make, one, to make changes close to the machine as possible, so when subsequent calls into Active Directory and the deployment happened, those changes were present and able to be found. Also, too, we did have some infrastructure that was located in different parts of the world that also had to interact with this. And we were able to make the changes in both through the web service at the location where the infrastructure was, then also where the machine was. And since they were additions, if there was a conflict, AD was able to handle that without a problem. But we had that change immediately available both to the infrastructure side and to the domain controller locally to the machine where subsequent calls would happen. And our last one here is deploy media current. And we use this because since we were allowing for self-service options and for deployment to be on USB media, we wanted to handle what happens if people keep that media around for a long time. And since we baked in a lot of updates, patches, et cetera, into our deployment each month, we wanted to make sure that they were always running on the most current media. So this would give them a warning for them if when they start out the deployment, let them know that it was old. They could continue on if they so chose to do so, but at least they would be notified and aware. And we actually did have at one point where originally I think we had around maybe 60 days, for example, for the media to be considered out of date. And we had at one point where we had a business reason to keep using media that was older than that. So we were able to change this an easy configuration setting on the web services side to up it to 90 days, and immediately everybody was using that 90 days figure. So I'd like to go over and switch over and show you a demo of how to call the web service. So here in Visual Studio, I have a script up, and this is similar to the one we showed earlier, but this is more of a specific example. So for demo purposes, you'll see here at the top, I'm going to hard code this IP address to a known IP address for our Chicago office. Now, ordinarily, of course, you wouldn't do this in your own deployments, but we do have code that we will be supplying to you as a download along with the slides for this presentation that not only makes this call on the web service, but will also get the IP address for you. So this is something that you can take and use for yourself when you get back to your organization. I'll go down to sort of and just highlight a few things right here in the code and show you. So earlier we saw, I think, those 6 lines of code to call the web service method. That was sort of a generic example. This one is a little bit more, obviously, specific here. A few things that you'll need to change. Obviously, the URL endpoint to your web service. In this case, I'm going to be running it off my local machine. We set up the parameters. In this case, we have a client IP address that we're going to be setting up. And we would set that as a environment variable with an MDT. And then we would set that value of that environment variable to the IP address that we determine. And then right here is where we actually make that call into the web service class that MDT provides for you. And then we do some logic down here to see if we got something back. If we didn't, we can log. And I actually have some echo statements in here to show this. And that's really about it. So let me go ahead. I'm going to, like I said, run this here locally on my machine. So let me kick that off. And I have a few displays here just for informational purposes. So you'll see we're going to make a call to the web service using the post method. There's the URL again, all the way down to the action that we're going to take. And there is our client IP address along with its value. And this is going to go ahead and run. As I'm running this locally on my machine, we have to make calls back into actually our Active Directory. It's going to take a little bit longer I'll show you an example that's actually running in our data center after this, and you can see that this is not a typical sort of response time. So there's our response from the web server. We got a HTTP 200, okay, and there's the name of our domain, our domain controller server, and it is a AMR, which is an American domain controller for us, so I know that is near our Chicago office. So let me go ahead. I'm going to close these down, and hope you can see this okay. Here is that same web service code running in our data center, and I'm just going to go ahead and put in that same IP address that I know is one in Chicago. And you can see it came back in about maybe a second, so much faster than what we had shown before. Let me switch back to our slides here. So as Chris and Joseph mentioned, we have global use of our image. We have one image that goes around to all of our 50-plus offices. So we need to support local languages. And we do, through MDT, have that selection available. We bake in some of the language packs for the OS and for global applications like Office into the deployment media, and the user or the tech is able to go ahead and select that. But as we wanted to have a self-service model for this, we wanted to really have that uptake for the user to do the deployment themselves. We have a custom launcher, an application that runs when they insert the media, and instead of having to know what to call an MDT, the launcher sort of takes care of that for them. But if we were expecting the user in a local office to run this, then we thought we'd have a much better uptake if we can give this to them in their local language. So we had a great idea to globalize our launcher application. And we use .NET for the launcher, and .NET has great functionality in it that you get out of the box for globalizing your application. And really the hardest part for us was getting those translated strings, those translated texts that we wanted to display. And for us, we crowdsourced that to our technical resources in our offices. And we said, hey, we would like to provide this for you. We think it'd be great for your users. Would you help us out with translations? And they were very happy to do that for us. And I think it worked out real well. And here is an example. If you can see on the left-hand side, we have our default English version of our launcher application. You can see in the sort of foreground, there is the message that kind of comes up after the initial checks are done to the machine. Does it have a network connection? Are the applications closed down, et cetera? We kind of go through a whole laundry list of things. Everything that we could think of that would prevent a successful upgrade, we take care of that up front. And if something is found to be wrong, we tell them what that is. The user can take the action. They can run the check again. Once they get sort of the nice green light, the check mark here, they know they're ready to go. And as you can see, we have that very same application on the right-hand side, but shown with some Japanese. And all this is a simple resource file that contains those strings. So no code changes. It automatically detects the language used when the application is run and will change over to the appropriate language. And we have a couple of links down here at the bottom that will take you to some easy instructions how to globalize those if you're using either Windows Form or if you happen to be using Windows Presentation Foundation for your app. And with that, I'm going to hand you back over to Chris Moreno, who's going to talk to you about remote deployment. Chris?
Thank you. Well, I know this is an interesting topic for many companies. Many users, technicians are even interested in this. I have a lot of content to go through, a lot of code examples, and a lot of information to cover. So if you have any questions, if you can just hold them to the end, we'll have a Q&A session after that. So one of the first things that I was asked was, hey, can we develop something that users could use in the field? A lot of our users are mobile. They rarely or never come into a local office. They're either at a client site or they work from home. There's no way of joining the domain from home without some kind of connectivity. In order to do this, we had to break it down and identify some key points or some key components which require some kind of corporate network connectivity. Things like joining the domain, security group membership, taking a computer object and adding it to a security group, or even users, adding those to specific security groups. Moving objects within Active Directory. Most companies will stage their deployment. So as they add them to Active Directory, they'll put them in one OU. As the process is completing their image deployment, they'll move the object to a different OU. Uploading BitLocker recovery passwords and keys, that's required so that you can have the restore later. If there's an issue with BitLocker and you need to grab the data, you'll need either a recovery key or a password. This is included as part of MDT. It's standard inbox, so you don't have to make any kind of UI or anything for the BitLocker, but you will need some kind of connectivity to upload those passwords and keys. And then lastly, we need to make sure that we have access to resources internally. Either that's going to be for a web service so that you can complete your deployment, a server so that you can pull files, or even a share where you're going to dump something. And in some cases, if you're configuring something like SCCM and you need some kind of communication between the client and server, you'll need that as well. So we're trying to find out who is this for? Who is it intended for? This is really for our users, right? This is so that a user can take this and start a deployment at home or at the client site. The best thing about this is it doesn't require that user to travel. There's no time out from their day. They don't have to leave their client site office. They don't have to leave home if that's where they primarily work from. This is good for them because it saves travel. There's no travel required, and it saves them time. We provide this in a USB key to the users. We had to make sure that it was small enough that that user could take it. They can perform this refresh on their schedule. There's no requirement for them to be in an office. They can do this at home. And we have there's additional capability for technicians. There's a lot of technicians that they might go to an off-site meeting and someone's machine dies and they need to reimage that workstation. They can do that from a hotel, any client location. There's tons of technicians that work off-site at a client location, and whenever someone brings in a machine and they need to re-image it, they don't have resources to join a domain. So what they can do is they can re-image those directly from that client site. So what's required to do a remote deployment? First thing, you're going to need a VPN solution. For our implementation, we use SSTP. So the things you want to configure are access. You want to limit group membership. You want to set connection timeouts so that when someone logs in VPN, they don't have a connection all day. You want to close those up. And also, you want to set the requirements for each user. You might have specific groups where you want to give them 30 minutes. You might have other groups where you want to give them 90 minutes. And then you can perform a health check to ensure that those clients that are logging in have certain things as part of the health. And those things could include anything from firewall being installed and the service up, antivirus, and automatic updates. We also have to leverage some kind of utility. In this method, we use web services that are exposed on the public internet so that we can query data and receive information for validating user credentials. Reason why we want to do this, we want to do it early on. This is not a separate deployment. This is the same deployment that we use for our intranet users. We just added functionality so they can do this remotely. So it's the same deployment. So we want to make sure that the credentials that we want to authenticate and validate, that we do that up front as part of our deployment, right? We want to start it, be able to leave, and come back and be done. So we want all of this work done up in the front. The last thing, we want to make sure that we customize MDT. First, we want to do is identify whether the deployment is local or remote. We want to provide some kind of UI, a wizard page. We can validate credentials so the user can type something in. We don't want to have those credentials automated, right? We don't want to expose any credentials. So you want to give this to a user. They have to type in a username and password. We're going to validate the credentials against the public web service. And then lastly, we just need to make a task sequence in our deployment to initiate some kind of VPN connection before the things like the join domain, the BitLocker key uploads, those types of things. So I'm going to go through a demo of what our current deployment provides, oops, sorry, that's the wrong one. There we go. So, like I said, this is the same deployment for our internet users as it is for our remote users. The only difference is they're going to get one extra screen here at the beginning of their wizard. And what we're going to do is we're going to prompt them for credentials. You can fill in the domain name and have that automated, but your username and password, you want to make sure they have to enter that information in. You'll type it in. You'll notice the password is an asterisk. You don't want anyone just to come around. That's specific, and I'm going to provide the code so that make sure that you can include the same type of stuff. Next button is available, so you would hit next. First thing we're going to do is we're going to disable this next button. You don't want people to keep on trying to validate credentials, sending 8 or 9 requests. So we want to disable that. We want to provide some kind of UI to the user that it's working. So we use checking VPN credentials here just to let the user know, hey, I'm working, I'm doing something. If they incorrectly enter their information, their username or the password, we want to provide them some kind of information that, hey, you need to change these credentials. You can retype your username and password, and as you type that information in, the next button will become available to you again. You'll hit next, and it'll go on to your next screen. So I'm going to provide now with some code snippets and some actual code that we use so that you guys can leverage to initiate an SSTP VPN. So just like Greg, I'm going to leverage the same Visual Studio. I'm going to go through and highlight some of the things where we need to make changes. So as part of the identifying if the machine is local or remote, we need to have this start at the beginning of the process. So ZTI Gather was a good place for us to leverage this. This is ZTI Gather as part of the MDT scripts. We just insert some of this code into ZTI Gather. For this implementation, we're using ping, but there's other things that you can leverage. Anything that's going to help you identify either an IP address, a host name, or something to leverage whether this is internal or remote. We're pinging an internal website, and based on that information, we're going to capture that into a variable, a string, and then we're going to check it. If the IP address that comes back from that is a specific IP subnet or IP address that I know is internal, I know it's an internal deployment. I don't want to initiate the remote VPN. So here we have some if statements. If it's found, we want to make the remote refresh variable as false. We create this variable up front before the wizards even pop up. Secondary, if we find that the IP address is not known, it comes up with some kind of specific IP address that we don't know what it is, we know it's an external deployment. So then we want to make sure that that variable is to true. We're going to create some logging just so we can have some information there. Now the first thing after the ZTI gather runs and gathers all these variables, now I have some variables I can work off of. I'm going to create a wizard page, right, a wizard pane. And I'm going to do is this pane ID is just something that I'm going to insert into the deploy wiz definition ENU XML. This is an MDT XML which is used to build all the panes. We're just going to insert this pane into there so that we can get some of that information back and prompt the user for credentials. The first part is just the header and some of the error coding, the error message with the invalid credentials that I showed you earlier, and also the error message for the checking for VPN credentials. We set up the username and password and the domain here. This is capturing all this data into specific variables, and we'll use this with a script that's tied to this as part of validation. One thing that I wanted to bring to your attention is this type password. This is how we ensure that that password is an asterisk. It's going to save this into MDT, but it's not going to be clear text. That way someone can't just open variables.dat and read it. The two things that we have here at the bottom, a condition. This is where we specify the property inside the ZTI gather. When I read it's true, I show the screen. If it's not, I don't show the screen at all. And the validation is going to run, which is the deploy wiz validation VBS. That's all the validation that runs within the panes. I'm going to set a function called validate VPN creds inside the deploy with validation so I can start the validation when I hit the next button. Now this code right here, I'm just going to enter this whole entire function at the end of the deploy with validation VBS file. And what it's going to do is when I hit the next button, it's going to start to run all of this, all of these lines. One of the things I want to make sure that you understand here is that the save all data elements and save properties is going to flush the data that we entered into the wizard into the variables.dat and make it available so that any scripts or anything that I try to key off of as part of the remaining scripts will be able to read that data. The first thing that I do when I hit this next button, I have a VPN cred status style display inline. This is where I tell the wizard page, hey, give some information back, let it know that I'm working. That's going to display that VPN checking credentials prompt. Also, we're going to disable the button. So we have this button next disabled. That way they can't keep on submitting the same request over and over. The invalid credentials, we want to make sure that they don't see this because we don't want to provide that until we get some kind of information back. We're going to run a script, an external script that we've created. The reason why we've created this and made this external is we don't want, if we had changes that we wanted to make, wanted to change the VPN server, change any of the scripting, we could do that outside without having to touch the validation VBS again. So we're going to run the script. It runs from inside your scripts folder. And based on what comes back, we're either going to hide the display of the checking VPNs and show the invalid, or we're going to do is set the function, which is validate VPN creds to true. And what this does is it tells the wizard page to go ahead, this is completed, go on to the next page. We're going to go on to the next one, which is our validate VPN creds. This is the one I was just mentioning. One of the things that we've done here, you don't have to do this, but I just made this so that you can take care of two things at one time. The credentials that we created, this VPN domain, VPN username, are actually tied to user domain, user ID, and user password. The user domain, ID, and password are automatically passed when you use your web service. So when you authenticate to your public web service, these credentials are passed. We're just associating the passwords that the information that we captured into the same variables that are already leveraged. You can actually change this, and this is something that you guys can read off of some of the links that I provide later on. One thing I want to highlight here is where we actually do the call to the web service. And what I'm doing is I'm just calling a public web service method that I've placed on the public internet, and I'm not really cared about the data, right? All I want to know is I get back a successful response. So I'm actually going to send a request out. If I get a response of OK, the credentials passed. Otherwise, it failed. And all I want to do is I want to pipe the information back to my wizard. That way it tells it, hey, you need to check the credentials again. Finally, what we're going to do is we're going to launch the VPN connection. So we said a couple of things here. I have max attempts here. That means that I'm going to create a loop so that even if I launch the VPN, I still want to check for connectivity. Sometimes after you launch a VPN, it takes a little while, it creates the routes. You don't really have all the connectivity there, so we create a loop. I only want it to loop 7 times. You have 6 here, but it starts at 0. I set an IP address, and I'm going to call a web method, which Greg talked about earlier, get domain controller. And I'm going to pipe that IP address so it just tells me, hey, I want to get some information back from this server. I variabilized some of the information that we use here that we need to launch the VPN connection, the SSTP VPN connection. Username, password, domain name. And then we have a phone book entry. We leverage RASDAL to launch our SSTP VPN. And then we have the phone book right there. If the counter, when we started, is on 0 or 3, I want to launch the VPN. The reason why it's not launching on 2 or 4 is if I launch on 0, I get a failure, and it's looking for the next 2 options, is looking for connectivity. I want to launch it again at 3, just in case I had that failure. It gives me some redundancy to launching the VPN. And then here's the launch of the RASDAL. So I launch RasDial. This is a section within my phone book entry, and then I variabilize the other information, which is the username, password, and the phone book, where we keep it in the scripts folder so it's automatically available to you. And then at the attempt counter, every time that we go through each one of the loops, we're going to increment the counter. So when it gets to 6, it times out. If it reaches 6, that means that there's some kind of failure to establish the connectivity. What we want to do is we want to pipe that information back into the BDD log so that we can get some information back. This is going to launch, going through this loop. It'll establish connectivity, and at that moment, inside your deployment, in the middle of your deployment, you'll have a VPN connection to your environment. You want to do this before join domain, before the BitLocker key uploads, stuff like that. And the last portion to this is what we need to do for our task sequences, and I'm going to show you that. So inside the MDT task sequence, you'll pick your task sequences that you have, and right before things like recover from domain, I'm going to create a command line, and I'm going to launch cscript to run that zcheck VPN connectivity. And this is the actual file that launches, which will establish VPN connection, do the loop, and then verify that you have it before it proceeds on to the next thing, which is the recover from domain. And then lastly, in the options tab, we want to make sure that it only runs if remote refresh equals true. We only want to run it when we're launching the VPN connection. We don't want to run it every single time. So with all of these scripts tied together, the task sequence, this should be able to give you the ability to run a remote deployment, include this into your deployments, and give you some additional capabilities and functionality as part of your deployment. So I provided some resources here. One is on creating an SSTP VPN. If you guys don't have that already, you can read that documentation. I have something on the MDT Wizard editor where it's a UI. You can include, import your deploy wiz definition E and U to make the changes that I talked about. And then last, there's mdtcustomizations.codeplex.com. We leveraged this site to do a lot of the web service stuff that when we were first starting out. So if there's something that's specific to your environment, you want to make some modifications, you can go to this site. They have plenty of scripts and plenty of examples. I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions and answers and hand this back off to the team.
So if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to use the mics. We'll be available afterwards as well if you wanted to come up and ask any questions then.
And I also wanted to mention that all of the code examples I provided and the VB scripts, we're providing as a download. They're available after the session. You'll be able to go out and use these, take the code snippets, include them. We've also provided a README as part of this so that you can try to go and implement this in your environments.
Does that include the source code for web search?
Sorry, what was that?
Does that include the source code for web search?
The web service code is going to be available on the show site. So that's the place to download it. It should be up there now. I don't know if it's actually up there. We didn't get a chance to check.
You mentioned about the USB stick that's attached to USB.
Yes.
How big is the USB?
Yeah, so
We have ours at under 16, and that supports, so depending on which kind of, what you're needing as far as language packs, drivers, and stuff like that, we actually have something, the code that we wrote to shrink some of that stuff down. So if you don't need language packs, you can actually, as part of a UI, you can actually remove some of those OS language packs. But we make this available that it fits on a 16 gig USB. And it provides functionality for all of our regional computer models, and it provides a functionality for all of the deployments and the remote capability within that one single USB.
Two questions related to the USB sticks still. How many did you actually have that you had to send out? And secondly, how do you prevent your product keys from leaking because you've physically sent these things out? And how do you prevent a breach of your product key with...
So great questions. I'll handle the second one first. So we use Windows 7 Enterprise, so there are no product keys. It's activated only through the KMS.
Okay, so you're using KMS, but you've got detached users. How do you handle that?
So VPN, right, gets us back, and we force the activation while you're on VPN, so that gets you back to the KMS, because it's illegal, it's against your contract to put a KMS on the public internet.
Right.
The other thing is we have direct access, which I think I mentioned, and one of the elements that we expose over direct access is our KMS. So
and the first question, how many did you actually have to create?
So how many USB keys did we create? One of the nice things is that with our 50 regions around the world, we had a distributed model. So what they did is they created, normally they would create 10 or less USB sticks in any given office, and then people could sign up for a 4-hour block of time over the 9-month deployment and get a USB stick, do the deployment, hand it back. One of the things that would be the next question is, how do you prevent people from stealing your USB stick, right? So it was funny because we hadn't actually thought of that, but our local tech teams started having this problem on day 1, right? So what they did is that they did a cable tie with a big giant instruction sheet to the USB stick, right? So it made it really inconvenient for the user to just walk away with the USB stick. Plus that gave them the instructions. And again, local team figured that out all on their own, got on one of our calls that was on one of the slides, told everybody else, they all thought it was a great idea, right? Crowdsourcing.
And also for executives and individuals who were working remotely and needed this key, there was a checkout process that they went through where users actually had to check out these keys in small quantities for specific users so that they could perform this remotely.
Quick one. I thought it was interesting that you chose to name the computers based on username. And one of the reasons I've seen a lot of people...
Based on what, sorry?
On username? On your username?
No, we did not.
We based it on absolutely nothing.
You're right. The username is just for information so that we can validate the credentials. The username, actually, we have a web service that goes out to our Active Directory, just queries to make sure that we just make some kind of random name with a specific value at the beginning so everything starts the same.
Okay.
And then it provides it back to our process, and it just automatically updates the computer name product.
Well, I guess my real question I was heading toward was, if you're trying to pre-stage computers, if you don't know what user they're going to go to, is that something you didn't plan to deal with, or did you just put in dummy information?
Yeah, as part of identifying where we needed to move that, we have a web service. As you enter that username at the beginning of the wizard, it's going to actually use that information, go to the web service. It's going to query that user's object. And based on the information that we get back, we can move it wherever we want. So if we have any kind of identifier in that user's object, we can move that computer wherever we'd like. You can do all of that in the background as part of your web service.
Was that what you were asking?
Not exactly. What I was thinking is,
That's what I was thinking. You were asking, hey, if you create a whole bunch of computers,
yes,
right? So that's exactly what one of our challenges was, right? We have teams, particularly in a very large office that has 5,000 people. They image 50 machines at a time overnight, right? So by having these completely random names, like literally, we have a string randomizer function in the web service that generates this garbage list of characters. It's 12 characters long. And then we just say, hey, is anybody else using that in the Active Directory? No. Okay, let me give it back to you. So all of the names are completely independently generic, and therefore anybody around the world can pre-stage 100 machines and do the BitLocker encryption overnight, and the next day when they need to provide that machine to a new user, it's literally a 15-minute process, and the user's on their way.
Thanks.
Right, good question.
How much time did it take to create the solution?
Sorry?
How much time did it take to create the solution?
To create the solution?
Yeah, because you deployed in 16 months.
Yeah, so we created the solution as part of a broader program, which included building direct access. So we were the first direct access at scale, and we're larger than Microsoft users of direct access now. We put in a brand new SCCM that was facing the internet. We put in a new enterprise certificate authority. So, because building a Windows 7 image wasn't as much fun as we needed to be, we just did all this other stuff as well. So we did the whole project in about 12 months. And a lot of it was, Nobody's ever done it before. One of the reasons we wanted to come today was to give you guys that head start so that you can take some of what it took us like 2 months to figure out. You can figure it out right now. So Chris, for the specific remote domain join, remote access piece, right? I think it took Chris probably, I don't know, 6 weeks to figure that out and test it, right? But now you've got the fully tested version that we've done thousands of deployments on.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Over here.
Yeah, I'm just curious about your decision process and utilizing MDT over SCCM.
Yep, great question. So we did not have an SCCM deployment at the start of this program. And the SCCM deployment that we did do, which is currently running for us, is 2 sites. One site has a small number of users for legal compliance reasons. The other site has 105,000 machines reporting to it. It's 100% internet facing, and all the primary sites, distribution points, and everything are in one data center. We have a gigabit of bandwidth from the public internet going into that data center to handle that. So for us, we really split up imaging of machines from health of machines. And because 85% of our users are on the internet 100% of the time, it made no sense for us to put SCCM infrastructure inside our network. So we consolidated it all in one data center, and that's how we drive it out. So we probably forever will not have SCCM as our OS deployment, not because we don't think it's good, but because the way our business is, it doesn't work on the internet for us. It made more sense to do it internally.
Have you actually integrated MDT into SCCM at all?
No.
Okay.
Because we don't do any OS. Our SCCM is purely about software distribution, patching, compliance management, and it's 100% on the internet.
Thank you.
How did you deal with application compatibility during this process?
Sorry?
Application compatibility during the process.
Application compatibility. So a great question. In the broader context of the program, we were probably one of the luckiest companies ever when it comes to app compat, because about 5 to 7 years ago, our senior leadership made the decision that everything was going to be a web app. And so we had very, very few fat client applications that we had to deal with. We did have some, right? And what we did is that we, because we couldn't build all of our infrastructure at the start, we started getting this image out to a bunch of the development teams, and we actually used VDI to give those development teams access to it without having to re-image their local machine. And we did VDI, not pooled, we did the dedicated in a lab environment. We had 10 or 20 virtual machines, and then the developers could use that to test their code and remediate their code. We were really lucky, though, that, web apps.
You don't know how lucky you are.
So.
How did you deal with catastrophic failures when you went through migrations? Machine dies halfway through.
Machine dies halfway through. So in the middle of a refresh, right? I'll be not politically correct, you're screwed.
Okay.
Right?
That's fine.
But at least at the start, our local technicians were in exactly the same sort of a question, right? Hey, Joseph, that sounds really cool, but when it doesn't work, it's my head that gets bitten off, not yours back in Chicago, right? So I would say for probably the first 3 months, they did full backups before they let the user do a refresh, right? But it's only after they gain that confidence. We also have, for a number of our people available, we leverage a cloud backup service for them, and so that helped to give them a level of assurance that even if it went bad, their data wouldn't be lost.
Okay.
And it's a great,
one more quick one.
And also to include, we have the pre-flight checklist that we do that we initiate before the install, so we can kind of capture some of those conditions and improve that ratio to ensure that we don't have those catastrophic
And
failures.
this is more informational for you. In Server 2008 R2 and Windows 7, there's functionality called djoin, which allows you to join a machine offline without any connectivity whatsoever. It generates a text file and you send it to the user.
yeah, that didn't scale for us.
Okay.
So yeah, we would love that, but it didn't scale, and then we had these other things that we had to be on the domain for.
Okay.
So.
My question's around language packs. We support 22 language packs in our environment, not only in the operating system, but also in various other applications. Because we're in a very distributed environment with 3,000 sites, is with anything from a 4G connection to satellite link in Africa. We try to break down our packages as much as possible so that when we're updating these things, they're not, so network heavy. So we broke out every language pack and we install it as part of our task sequence. What steps have you done, and maybe what recommendations can you provide to maybe reducing or a best practice for implementing language packs? Because in our scenario, we have languages that we need to be on every system per country requirement, and then the user's also selecting their own UI language. So even though in Kazakhstan they may need Russian, the user might say, I only want English, but the requirement is that it also have Russian as well.
I can answer that. As part of the deployment, itself for OS languages, you can include the language pack within your deployment, and then you have the option of just choosing it and selecting it. So as part of the MDT process, it'll apply that in the offline state before the first boot. But as far as applications, if you needed to do something like that, we actually included a process in our deployment we call localization, where each GU can actually take something, create an executable or some kind of XML which will parse through and apply anything that's specific to their region. And then also the applications themselves, we provide an optional download where we've selected the applications, specifically Office, where all those language packs are available. And it's included as part of the deployment. All they have to do is select through and choose that application, and it'll install. If they're not needed for each GU, you can just go ahead and wipe out that folder. You're not doing anything. It's in the applications folder. You can just go ahead and remove it. But for those GUs that they know that they're going to have French, Spanish, or something like that, they can include those and make sure that they just don't remove those from that folder.
Have you run into any issues with, the MDT will parse through in the offline language installation, but it only does it once. If you have multiple items in your task sequence, it won't allow you to install those. It's going to actually fail the second language pack in the sequence.
I'm not sure I'm really catching, but maybe I can talk to you right afterwards and try to figure out exactly what you're going through.
Hi, quick question. For those users that are on Windows XP and PointSec is on the machine, you mentioned that you basically do a complete wipe and you have the data moved. So are the users responsible at that time then to move their data? And with the task sequence, you mentioned two hard link. So I guess I just wanted to see how you blended the two in there, if the users are actually moving it.
For XP, we had the technicians do it. So it was not an end-user self-service model because we felt the risk was much too high for the end user to move their own data, mess it up, and then come back on us or our local technician friends. So for XP, there was a scheduled process. You have to give your machine in. They use USB hard drives, do capture, so that moves data from the running OS to the USB hard drive. Then they do a prep, and then they do a restore. So
Okay, so then the only time you used hard link was from 7 to 7 migration?
From Vista to 7.
From Vista to 7.
And we've had people do 7 to 7. One of the interesting things that happen, if you see it in Windows 8, right, there's that reset button or refresh button where it says, yeah, my OS is kind of funky. Let me go back to a clean OS, but don't delete my data. So we've got people who still believe that Windows gets crusty, right? And so every year they just want to rerun a refresh on their existing Windows 7 domain joined laptop just so they get a fresh OS, but they don't lose their data. And they think that's really cool. I haven't done it myself because I think Windows 7 rocks, but we found that that was a really interesting thing that we never designed for, was people wanting to do an in-place refresh, or they're switching clients, right? They work on this client, now they want to go to this other client, they had a bunch of client-specific stuff installed, they want to get rid of all that in a really clean way. They'll stop in the office for a day on their way between, joining their new project and refresh their machine.
So for those remote users, they weren't running Windows XP when they were using the thumb drives?
So the remote is only for Vista.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
With XP, with PointSec,
Right.
you're pretty much in the office with a technician.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You just mentioned client-specific stuff installed, which relates to my question. And it is, first, your XP and Vista systems, how clean and regimented were those installs before this process started? And depending on that, did you have issues with rogue applications?
So I'll interpret clean and regimented in the Brad Anderson model, right? So from a control perspective, our users are administrators on their workstations. So the range of challenge was broad. And so we basically said, look, you're not getting any apps back that you had on, except what's in the base image, and here's what the base image has. We have an existing web-based software store. We'll be going over to SDCM 2012 in the future. But we said all of the licensed corporate applications are there. If you're choosing to steal software from somewhere else, or you have a consumer software like iTunes, right, on your machine, it's your responsibility. That's consistent with how we've done it. As a matter of fact, it's better than what we've done in the past, right? So we didn't have a lot of user pushback. In terms of rogue applications, there are people who have said, no, I'm not upgrading because I have this application that only runs on XP, right? Sooner or later, they're going to find that there's corporate applications that they can't run or things they can't do because we no longer really support XP. We don't support Vista. We don't support XP really at all. For XP, we had an option for some of our users in specific cases to use XP mode on Windows 7 because we're an enterprise licensee. We have enterprise. And that worked out really well if somebody had a specific application for a client scenario where they needed to run X and it only ran on XP, right? Then they could just use XP mode to run that application. It wasn't something we really liked because the maintenance of that XP image was non-existent. Never mind bad, it didn't exist. So there's a couple of ways to go at it. It's not always clean though.
So then there would potentially be people out there who haven't upgraded saying that they have an urgent app that you guys haven't approved, and therefore they're going to lose it, so they haven't done their upgrade yet, or?
We do have some people who haven't upgraded. The number is really small, and the best part is that when they get a new laptop, they don't get a choice.
Okay.
So sooner or later, their laptop is going to come up for end of life, and they can hold on to it for a certain amount of time until they simply get told, you have to give up your laptop because there's no warranty, there's no hardware support, or it'll just break.
And being as geographically diverse as you are you running into issues with offices saying, no, I got this other thing and it is critical to me doing my job? You've got just support saying, tough, it's gone.
Yeah, our leadership basically stood behind it and said, if we want to get to the cost model that we desire, right, we have to do it this way.
Well, that's almost better than any technical piece.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is from the business, right? All of this comes from the business. The business said direct access is important. The business said Windows 7 is important. The business said keep the cost down. And whenever we had challenges, we went back to our business sponsors and said, you make the call. It's your money. It's not my money, right? I'm a cost center for my company, like most of us, right? So I said, you make the call, right? Okay, last one, and then we'll step down.
Earlier, you guys were talking about using DFS in your deployment. Can you explain how you did that? What was on DFS?
So DFS is used to get the content out to the offices all around the world. So we put every month we build our image and deploy our image every month to the entire world. And we put it on a single DFS server in, I don't know where it is now.
Chicago.
And then it goes out over our corporate network. And we always drop it on a Friday. And then it pushes that out. And there are receiver servers in all the countries. And they then can hub and spoke it down if they need to all the other local offices. And then that's how they get the content, the 30 gigs or whatever. And then they will put it on a WDS server or something like that.
Okay, so
2008 R2 is really cool.
So you were taking your image at that point, once it was replicated, and then putting the whole image on WDS?
Yes,
or were you
push
using
out the whole deployment share. So we push out the Light Tech deployment share, and then they can use that to put it on their WDS servers in the local offices.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
We know we're standing between you and lunch. Thanks.